What if Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz? Imagine if one narrow sea route suddenly shuts down, and fuel prices across the world skyrocket overnight. This is not just a hypothetical scenario. It could trigger a massive global economic shock. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. It is approximately 167 kilometers, 104 miles long. At its narrowest point, it is only about 39 kilometers, 21 nautical miles wide. However, the actual shipping lanes used by oil tankers are much narrower, only about 3 kilometers wide in each direction, separated by a small buffer zone. This means a disruption in this small passage could impact the entire global economy. Why is it so important? Nearly 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through this strait. That equals around 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day. Around 25% of global liquefied natural gas, LNG, also travels through this route. If Iran blocks this waterway, the consequences would not remain limited to the Middle East, they would spread worldwide. Which countries would be most affected? China. China is the world's largest oil importer. Around 40 to 45% of China's crude oil imports come from Gulf countries through this route. If the strait closes, manufacturing costs in China would rise, export prices could increase, global supply chains may be disrupted. India imports nearly 55 to 60% of its oil from Gulf nations via this passage. If supply is interrupted, petrol and diesel prices could spike sharply. Inflation may rise, transportation and electricity costs would increase. For a developing economy, this could create serious economic pressure. Japan depends heavily on Gulf oil. Around 80 to 90% of Japan's oil imports come from this region. A disruption could force Japan to use its strategic oil reserves, reduce industrial production temporarily. South Korea imports approximately 70 to 80% of its crude oil through this route. Industries like electronics and automobiles could face production slowdowns if supplies are delayed. The European Union receives roughly 20 to 30% of its oil from Gulf suppliers. If the strait is blocked, fuel prices in Europe would rise, manufacturing costs would increase, inflation pressures could worsen. The United States imports a smaller share directly from the Gulf, around 10 to 15%. However, oil markets are global. If global supply drops, oil prices in America would still rise. Gasoline prices would increase. Stock markets could experience volatility. What about Gulf exporting countries? Not only importers, exporters would also suffer. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Iraq, and Kuwait rely heavily on this passage to ship oil and gas. If exports stop, daily revenue losses could reach billions of dollars. Government budgets would be affected. Economic stability in the region could weaken. How high could oil prices go? Experts estimate that if the strait were fully blocked, oil prices could jump to 100–150 per barrel, or even higher. Global inflation could accelerate. Shipping insurance costs might double. If oil tankers are forced to reroute around Africa, shipping time could increase by 10 to 15 days. Freight costs would rise significantly. Food and consumer goods prices could also increase. In simple words, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the main energy artery of the global economy. If it is blocked, Asia would face fuel shortages, Europe would struggle with inflation, America would see rising gasoline prices, Middle Eastern exporters would lose billions. A regional conflict could quickly turn into a global economic crisis.